Yeah, thank you everyone. This is Anup. I just uh, I just talked in the beginning also. And today we have another session from Muktaji that is on the cultural competence and domestic violence. And she is, teaching in many universities across California and other places. And she is interested in issues of gender justice and has been activist in rape crisis and domestic violence movement for over 20 years. So 20 years is amazing number of years for sure. She is deeply committed to service-based learning and inciting social changes through art, music, and poetry. She holds a PhD, so that is why I put doctor. And uh, uh, Muktaji, pardon me, whatever I found from the internet, and I have put it here because I did not have time.
No
Okay,
problem.
yeah. And
Hmm.
she holds a PhD in anthropology from Stanford University and has taught across multiple campuses, including Stanford University and UC Davis. And today she is going to talk about cultural competence and domestic violence. So Muktaji, I can keep slides moving on, and you can talk about, or you want to share your screen, that is also fine.
Okay, if you don't mind, may I share my screen? Because I just realized that my screen also has pointers which I kind of click in.
Okay,
So it
okay, okay,
might be too
fine.
much.
Yeah, that
Before
is great. Yeah, yeah.
before Muktaji starts, Kailash, I want to add a few words of welcome for Muktaji, and I'm so grateful that you're giving us the time and opportunity to hear your amazing experiences in this area. I've known her for many years. She's a champion, a great role model for young ladies around, and I have also admired the work they've done at Maitri. So welcome, Muktaji, and good to see you virtually anyway after a few years. Okay, thanks again.
Yeah, such a pleasure. I mean, one of the added bonuses of being in class here today is to sort of reinitiate conversation with Kailash. It's been so long. It's been far
I
too
know.
long. But I also want to applaud you and your team for this yeoman service that you're doing. I logged in at around 1 o'clock and I heard both Amita and Mangala speak. And I also heard many of the observations and questions and comments that came up from the listeners, the audience, and the students. And I'm just really blown away by this gap that existed and your attempt to try and fill it. So congratulations, everybody. This is not easy work. It's certainly not easy work to be on Zoom for hours on end. And so I want to say thank you. I also want to say that it's really nice to go after this wonderful group of people. Amita spoke about sort of the specific challenges of multi-generational caregiving and the dynamics in the South Asian culture. And Mangala did this wonderful kind of journey through what makes a safe space, what are the dynamics of how one validates who one's listening to, puts away one's judgment, and also thinking through sort of how one can create a space by which people share as much as they're comfortable with. And also then looking at sort of the religious dynamics that come into play. And then the last sort of homework assignment that Mangala posed to you stumped me because she said, think of this as if it were a blank canvas. Don't think in terms of your belongings, your religious identities or social identities. And I was thinking how difficult this homework assignment is going to be because much of what I would like to talk about is to say that culture to all of us is like water to fish. We live in it, we breathe in it. We don't often recognize or acknowledge its existence. It sort of works as a subtext through which we filter what we observe around us and how we make sense of it. And so what I actually want to do is to sort of make a little expose through culture and its insidious and not so insidious ways in which it affects how we become judges of what we're seeing around us. So essentially, it's a three-part workshop.
Mukta, I'm sorry, one interruption. Mukta, I think your camera needs slight lowering because your face is not coming on at least my screen fully. A little bit more.
So, you know, I'm working with a desktop. And the camera is up here. So is this okay? I'll probably be switching off the camera anyway as I make my way.
That's fine. That's
yeah?
fine.
Is that all right? Sorry.
If you have a pillow, no, you don't need a pillow. You need to raise the chair, I think. Okay.
No, the table gets in the way.
No problem.
all these ergonomic problems of aging.
Yeah.
So did you guys hear what I said? Because I lost the gallery for a few seconds.
No. We can hear you.
Okay, super. And may I share my slides right now as well?
Sure, sure.
Yes.
Excellent. And then Mangala, what's my latitude in terms of stopping? What is my hard stop? 4:45 or?
You can go on, I would say even up to 5 minutes before 5.
Okay.
Because we only need 5 minutes to wrap up usually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. And then are you sharing my screen or should I?
Anupji?
Yeah, so Muktaji wants to share, her screen. That is fine, perfectly. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just do this for 1 second. If you guys give me a second. In the meantime, feel free to get a glass of water, stretch, etc. Okay, we're good. You can see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
lovely.
I can see it.
So I want to start actually with this image, which I think is a very telling example of how we hold dear as values and ideals certain things, and what we hold dear may not be felt appreciated or understood by others. So what I want to do is take sort of the first third of today to question the role of our own points of view based on our socialization and what the ideal norms of our world are, from which we filter in what we're hearing from the people that we're serving. I'm assuming that the people, I'm going to use the word client because that's what we do at My3 to the people that actually use My3 services. And part of the reason we sort of put in that word versus service is because we want them to think about it as an equal relationship. In the ways in which business meanings of clients are constructed. So occasionally I will conflate between client, people we serve, constituencies, at-risk populations. They pretty much all mean the same thing, individual or collective. So the big question is, how can we be aware of our own biases and beliefs and their impact on our work as caregivers? And how can we respect an individual's identity marker, that individual's tradition, customs, values, beliefs, etc., and find appropriate interventions without making stereotypical assumptions? This is crucial. How do we not make stereotypical assumptions? So looking at sort of the first part of this 3-part training workshop, and I would like to call on you to make notes, offer examples, maybe even discuss in small groups if we have some time to do breakout sessions. And throughout my presentation, I'll sprinkle in anecdotal evidence to bring home some key messages. But I want to remain mindful and intentional about what I say on the screen, because I know many of you are in a room with other people moving back and forth, and I want to make sure that I don't use triggering words or very disturbing imagery, because I don't want words falling on young ears or people that haven't protected themselves from this information. So just a little caveat out there. As we launch into answering some of these questions, I want to ask you, take a minute to note down one culture you feel you know a lot about, and one culture you know very little about. Just as a little home exercise for yourselves in this 1 minute, note down aspects of these cultures, and you can choose a culture, use whatever definition you have of culture right now, and choose it based on religion or age or sexual orientation, or occupation, recreation, whether they own pets or not, whether they're immigrants or not, whether they're undocumented immigrants or not, etc. And for this particular exercise, feel free to use stereotypes, because sometimes stereotypes are what we lean into. And I want to actually validate both the importance and the dangers of resorting to stereotypes. So just a minute, maybe 30, 45 seconds to just note down a culture we feel we know a lot about, and a culture that is perhaps alien to us, unfamiliar. Just for those of you who like to be organized in this 3-part workshop, the first part is on cultural competence. The second part is on the connections between culture and domestic violence. And the third part is on the actual work of Maitri. All right. So just put aside your notes for a second as we make our way through the next set of slides. Asking ourselves what cultural competence is. How can you, as HCI students and workers and Ananda co-workers, and sort of compassionate, empathetic listeners, think about being competent culturally as you work through your client bases. Think about the ways in which it involves an understanding and an appropriate response to a unique combination of cultural variables. And like I reminded you of identity markers in the previous slide, ability, so whether someone is able to do things or disabled, age, is someone elderly, is someone young, are they middle-aged, what their beliefs might be, what their ethnicity might be, what languages they speak, what their gender identity might be, race, religion, socioeconomic status. A client is bringing all of these to their interactions with you, and unbeknownst to you, so are you bringing your interactions to them, right? Think about sort of also the examples of acculturation. Is somebody just, how we used to call it, fresh off the boat? Or has someone lived here for a while, right? Is someone second generation? So for example, like I promised you, I will sprinkle this with anecdotes. Many years ago, I worked with an Indian client at Maitri, and she would call me, and then she just stopped calling me entirely. And by me, I mean the hotline, which is now called the helpline. And then one day I happened to hear from her again, and I said, what happened? Is everything okay? I was worried. And she said, Didi, आपने मुझे नहीं कहा था कि 911 के बाद मतलब hang up करना पड़ता है पहले और फिर 911 call करना पड़ता है. So she called the agency's a number, got the voicemail, in which we had then said, this was about 27 years ago, then said, if you're in trouble or if you need immediate assistance, call 911. She didn't realize that she first had to put down the phone, hang up, and then call 911. So we actually made that change and stated that in our voicemail. These are things that many of us who have lived in this country take for granted, right? But for many people who have just arrived, all of these very sort of what seems to us common sense isn't quite that common. And it is for no fault of theirs. There is a certain cultural texture within which people learn to operate. I know many of us have seen films and books about sort of this immigrant generation in which we straddle both our homeland and our host land. And, two very famous names that come to my mind is For Here or To Go, and Water No Ice. So sort of these are very specific cultural idioms that we use for people that have sort of moved here and are first generation immigrants. Another example is the way in which a client who was in a shelter in Livermore called us one night. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and we received a call. And she basically had been thrown out of the shelter because they found a kirpan in her room. She was an Amritdhari Sikh, a woman that actually practiced her faith and practiced a very stringent, a very extreme faith in which she wore a turban and carried kirpans. And we had to lobby quite extensively with shelters to say how this is actually a religious iconry and not weapons, right? So the ways in which people actually carry their culture into quote unquote what are intended to be safe spaces. Think about sort of this lovely example of how what we hold dear as society also shifts, evolves, and morphs. That culture is organic, that culture is historical, right? We used to at one time worship the fertility goddess who was roundness personified. We were at the time skinny cavemen. Now we deal with obesity and we worship the thin, fragile figure. Right? So it's just an example of the fact that what we assume culture to be as static is far from it. But sometimes we're not able to see ourselves along that larger arc because we are a blip on the radar, or we see our immediate world as if it always were that. Moving on to sort of thinking about culture, you'll be interested to know that there are over 160 official definitions of culture. And here, humor me as an anthropologist, because I really want to theorize sort of the idea of culture. And I want to offer you the two most comprehensive, that culture is shared, learned, and intelligible, known to other members of that society. So think here of Edward Tyler's wonderful definition of culture. The complex whole, right? It's not just a component, but it's a complex whole. It includes all of these things. It highlights not that culture is biologically inherited, but rather it happens from growing up in a particular society through exposure to a specific cultural tradition. So note that it is acquired, it is learned, very much like domestic violence is acquired and learned. And that in itself offers a moment of rupture and optimism for all of us in the field, because if it is learned, it can be unlearned, right? It's not something that's biologically innate. Another wonderful example is Gertz's example of control as inherent in culture, that cultures are sets of control mechanisms, but again, highlighting that culture is learned. What Gertz is telling us is animals learn through experience. We as humans learn through both experience, but also communication. That there is a communication that happens. Oftentimes, this communication is taught, but oftentimes we learn purely through observation and interaction. And how do we learn? What is the script of culture? It is symbols. So very quickly, sort of to gather together the way of life of our people, which then brings us the question, if we are dealing with a certain constituency as this group of people, what is this constituency's ideal? What are their values? What are their perceptions? How do they make sense of their experiences? And then how do they in turn generate behavior to deal with these experiences? So note that culture is deeper than just behavior, right? It is the underlying ideas, values, perceptions that guide and shape that behavior. Many times as caregivers, you will only see how people behave, but it is very hard to actually uncover or expose or dismantle where this behavior is stemming from, the origins of it. The three main arenas of culture that I want us to think about is cognitive, rules, behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, perceptions. For example, the ways that we think about older people to be respected, but sometimes that translates as older people infantilized, right? Many of us treat older people as if they were children. They don't know what they want. They can't do the things that they can, that they want to be able to do, but we can't argue with them. Or that it is okay to hit our kids because that's the way to discipline them. Hitting is only another form of love. Just a variety of different ideas on the spectrum that we think about, the rules, behaviors, etc., that govern how we behave, how do we do things, the manifestation of this cognitive value. So for example, for those of us that are Hindus in this room, I know when I grew up, I was trained to actually do namaskar if my foot touched a broom, because a broom was seen as an icon of Lakshmi, or I would do namaskar if my foot touched a book, or of course, if I kicked somebody else by mistake. These are quick subconscious gestures that we do even today. So I will be hanging out with a white colleague, and by mistake, if my shoe touches her, I will instantly do that, right? We resort as human beings to things that are habitual, and these behaviors are coming from a cognitive sense of what we hold dear. Then there are also the material aspects of culture, right? The physical products of culture, symbols. For example, my passport would be a physical product of my legitimate presence here in the United States. My Mangal Sutra, which I have not worn since day 2 of my marriage, which is sitting in my locker. But of course, my Mangal Sutra as an icon of my marriage status. As a Hindu married woman, a kada or a veil or a janeyu, different ways in which physical manifestations of our culture are presented on our bodies. Some of us can actually present ourselves in the world as devoid of them. Some of us cannot, right? So my Amritdhari client, for example, lived life wearing a turban the entire time, right? She carried on her body, she embodied the material aspects of culture. So very quickly, again, just to give you a break from my voice, note down in your text, in your notebooks, against the culture that you have said you know well, make one little example of the cognitive, behavioral, and material aspects. Just again, a 30-second intervention. In the culture that you think you know well, what might be a rule or a value or an idea or an attitude? What might be its behavioral manifestation? And what might be the physical products associated with it? Okay, let's regroup. And then we ask ourselves the question, why do cultures exist? Is that just something that happened by the by? Or is it indeed our operating system, right? Much of what we do, how we treat our parents, our spouses, our children, our neighbors, our bosses, our employees, come from culture. So for example, if you think about domestic violence or misogyny in general in South Asia, it cannot be removed from the spectrum of how we all enjoy dancing on chikni chameli or tandoori murgi, right? The ways in which many of our very popular commercial music objectifies women, makes women the objects to be consumed by the male gaze, by men, etc. What might seem as unsupported, insignificant, or unrelated material actually comes to bear on how we live our lives as men, women, and everything in between. I see the chat session flashing, so I'm just going to get to that for a second. Okay. All right, Mangala.
Sorry for
No
that.
problem. No problem. Okay. So think about then, okay, now a little. There we go. So thinking through the ways in which the conscious and subtext of our thoughts and actions are often what governs our judgment or our bias of the people that we are interacting with. So a sort of moment of honest revelation. Some years ago, I was dealing with a client who came to My3. And in my conversations with her, somehow it emerged that she and her husband had never actually met one another before they got married. They agreed to marry each other based on phone conversations and on video recordings of both of them at some weddings. And I had this sort of big moment in which I was like, oh God, like, how do you marry somebody you've never met before? And then instantly I was confronted with my own prejudice and judgment that I was making, right? Because as a woman that is married through an arranged marriage system, oftentimes arranged marriage is also viewed through the same lens by people that have chosen their partners, right? How can you marry somebody that your parents pick out for you? So across a spectrum, there is sort of this belief that you can only marry somebody that you really know well. If that were the case, why do we have so many shelters and domestic violence agencies for people in Western world who have met and seen and hung out with their partners for many, many years before they actually married them? But essentially what I want to point out to you here is, even after many years of being in this kind of work, we are still confronted with our own judgments and biases. And we really have to make the honest effort of asking ourselves, where is this coming from? Where is this resistance to understanding somebody's choice of life coming from? And what can we do about it? So there will be more on this later through other anecdotes, but I want to make ourselves, safe enough to have to deal with the other larger, more important pieces that lie ahead. So I want to quickly sort of show you a variety of different symbols. And again, note for yourself what they bring up in you, right? What these symbols signify, because symbols are in many ways verbal and non-verbal, universally recognized scripts of culture. Oftentimes they represent shared beliefs, and oftentimes they're organic. Think about the core values of such symbols. What do they generate in terms of cultures? So for example, this idea of the McDonald's or of the American flag, in many ways signifying American culture, which in turn signifies liberty, fraternity, equality. The idea of this diamond ring as much more than just carbon and metal, right? It signifies a whole cosmology of monogamy and love and life together and children and loyalty, right? But it also changes, right? So for my niece at the moment is looking at engagement rings and thinking, I don't want a blood diamond. I don't want to begin my relationship with people that have been violated and exploited by the capitalist societies. So these symbols too start changing their meaning. This man in ethnic gear holding a mobile telephone, for many of us, a mobile phone, for many of us signifies contradictions and conflicts in what we think of core cultural symbols. And then this really, really adorable piece. I saw a guy today at Starbucks. He had no smartphone, tablet, laptop. He just sat there drinking his coffee like a psychopath. This idea that each of us needs to actually have a device that we have to look into and can't be looking into the outside world because it violates our core ideas of privacy. And then last of all, this lovely, beautiful silver thali with amazing amounts of food. Think also about the ways in which food is such an important aspect of culture. I remember the years that I was growing up and the ways in which I was taught how to put salt at the 12 o'clock spot in the plate, and the starch, the rice or the roti at the 6 o'clock spot of the plate, and the sabzi or the curry at the 3 o'clock. And these are not just by random things. My parents' parenting, my growing up, all of these things were judged on whether I could serve a plate right or not. Right? And that again is a very cultural thing. I hate that we can't break out into discussion right now because I see some faces dying to say something. Okay. And then also thinking about the ways in which culture is dynamic, it is adaptable. We use culture to adapt to shocks and sudden changes in our life. I want to give you an example of several years ago, there was a woman in extreme danger from her very physically abusive partner, who we were trying to place in a shelter. And she refused to go, and she would find all sorts of reasons why she couldn't go. And then finally she told us, you know, I don't want to go there because I'm vegetarian, and I feel like people will, you know, I can't cook in the kitchen in which they're cooking pork or they're cooking beef. I can't cook in those pots and pans. I don't know what these people eat. Will they make me eat non-veg food? And, you know, here we are talking about a home situation which is so dangerous for her that her lethality assessment was at an all-time high. We didn't know if she'll survive a month from now. And yet she was resistant to go to a shelter because she felt like it violated her religion, right? So at one end you feel like, what? You know, look at the options. But at another end, you realize that people hold on to culture when everything around them is falling apart. They hold on to the things that they hold most dear to them. So what we did at Maitri then was initiated a pot and pan project by which everybody that went to shelters would be given a set of pots and pans that they could keep with them even after they moved out of the shelter, brand new pots and pans. And then also non-perishable goods like dal and chawal, a little salt, etc., so that people didn't have to worry about that as they were gathering their belongings and leaving their home. So what I want to point out to you is how theory actually plays out in real life, how we can actually use these moments to build our programs and develop ways in which we make ourselves more accessible, and we refine what services and what a sort of buffet of services we offer our clients. So again, very quickly, I don't want to waste too much time on this, thinking about cultural traits as universal, general, and particular. We all of us as human beings eat food, right? That's a universal trait. We all more or less cook food. That could be a universal trait. How we cook food might be a general trait. Do we saute? Do we stir fry? Do we steam? Do we broil? Do we bake? And then what do we eat it with might be a particularity of that food. Do we eat with chopsticks? Do we eat with forks? Do we eat on banana leaves? Do we eat with our fingers? And just because this is a super boring time of the day, I want to put in a fun example, taking food to the earlier step or maybe the later step and saying poop, right? We all poop. That is a universal trait, right? But the generality is, do we poop in a commode? Do we poop in an Indian style toilet? A particularity would be, and especially in these present troubling pandemic times, do we use tissue paper, right? Or do we use water? Just a little humor to lighten the day. And then thinking about ideal culture versus real culture when we think about traits, what people say they should do and what people actually do. So for example, in Hindu culture, we have so many goddesses. We have such amazing, magnificent iconry to express the Shakti, the feminine, right? The power in the feminine. How then to explain the plethora of rapes that happen in the country, right? How do we make sense of these contradictions? Men and women are seen as equal in the United States, as deserving of equal rights, as deserving of equal resources. How then do we explain the large number of shelters and support services for battered women in the United States? So what is an idealized culture doesn't necessarily translate into what real culture is. And I want to give you an example of Schneider, who did his research among Micronesian people. They're known as the Yaps. So among Yaps, there was a belief that coitus had nothing to do with conception. Right? That conception happened because ancestors blessed you and they put a spirit into you, and women thus had children. It had nothing to do with men and women actually having intimate relationships. And Schneider kept trying to tell them, no, 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 don't you see? And this is funny because Schneider came from a culture in which we have the Virgin Mary, right? And yet he was trying to express to the Yaps how there could not be any conception without coitus. And the Yaps refused to acknowledge it. Then one afternoon, as they were all resting, a Yap man said to Schneider, we need to go, we need to get the pigs to mate with the sows, it's mating season. And so Schneider said, aha, look, haven't I told you for all these years that you must mate in order to have children? And then the Yaps turned to Schneider and said, Yeah, you said that, but people are not pigs. Right? So sort of speaking to this idea that even though innately you might think such a thing, there is a sense of what is valued, what is understood, what is even spoken, and what is left unspoken in cultures. So I want to move to the second part. Let me just take a quick look at the time. Yeah, I want to move to the second part, which speaks about just a highlight into what is domestic violence. It is a very fraught term. And all of these terms actually speak to pretty much the same kinds of experiences with or without a few subtle changes. Some terms, for example, do not fully encapsulate the South Asian condition. So thinking about the ways in which now culture enters the realm of domestic violence, thinking not just about the norms and values, but how these norms and values are expressed depending upon other identity markers. So why then should we consider culture in the context of domestic violence? First of all, it helps us understand the very complex ways in which people respond to sexual violence. The reason I bring up sexual violence is because marital violence, and I get to sort of speaking about what exactly is the definition of domestic violence, but to speak about many things in a marriage which aren't talked about by people. And again, I don't want to use certain words. I want them to just be on screen so you can see them, but people in your house can't necessarily hear these words. Speaking to the ways in which we have both victim narratives and heroine narratives in our mythologies, but asking ourselves, which are the narratives that people most lean into when they deal with a crisis? So for example, some years ago at Maitri, we had a woman that got married, came here, was sent back by her husband. She was on only a one-time H4 visa. So when she went back, assuming she was going to go back again, she found that her visa didn't allow her to go back. So basically, her husband conned her into going back home. Was in a relationship with another woman here, which is why he didn't want her around. And then 7 or 8 years later, reached back again to her and said, come, let's make a home together. And her parents basically invoked Sita, invoked this idea of abandonment in our mythology, saying that, see, even Sita, who's a goddess, had to go through it. These are the trials and tribulations of being a woman. So we have both heroism and victimization, both reflected in our mythologies, but it's interesting to see what gets invoked, what gets summoned when people make sense of their crises. Right. Speaking about sort of the ways in which diversity among individuals, and again, here we walk this tightrope between stereotyping and remaining vigilant to people's individual lives. So for example, many years ago, I met a woman, she was not a client, she was a Maitri volunteer, that wore a sari, and my immediate response to seeing how she presented herself was, oh, looks like she's just arrived. She was a third generation American, right? She chose to wear a sari. She chose to dress herself in that manner, right? So to recognize, even as we lean into stereotypes, that people often do things that are very individual for themselves. To give you sort of the UN's definition of violence, any act of gender-based violence that results in or could potentially result in physical, sexual, mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of acts, coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty in public or in private life, right? There are many forms of violence against women: sexual, physical, emotional abuse, dowry deaths, honor killings, infanticide, feticide, deliberate malnutrition, denial or access to education. All of these fall on a spectrum of violations against women. Think also about societal or public sphere harms, right? Eve teasing, many of us are popularly sort of familiar with this popular notion of Eve teasing, right? Sexual harassment. sexual harassment and abuse by authority figures. So for example, TIS, which is a gender institute in Bombay, did a brilliant research project a few years ago and discovered that many women did not go to police stations in India to report violence because they would be further violated by cops, inspectors, asking very prying and violating questions about their personal lives. Also, equally, many women could not put forth a complaint unless they were accompanied by other men in their family, a father or a brother or a son, thus validating sort of the male voice in the presence of the woman rather than giving the woman herself a way to express what was going on. Thinking about the ways in which culture cannot and should not be used as an excuse for domestic and sexual violence. But that said, understanding the history that guides people's ideas of what is acceptable behavior, what is criminal behavior, what can and cannot be discussed in public spaces. I cannot tell you how many times I'm at a party and my close friends will say something like, hey, don't do that, Mukta's at Maitri, she'll report you. Sort of the ways in which people invoke this idea that certain things are acceptable behavior, certain things are criminal behavior. Many of you have heard this with little children saying, oh, you can't be spanking your kids in a grocery store because they'll call the cops and, you know, everyone will come and take away your kids and so on and so forth. In some situations, it's been known to happen, but also I want you to remain vigilant to sort of the dominant narratives that circulate in our imaginary through which we make sense of what it is, something that can be said publicly, what is acceptable and what is not. In many cases, for example, ideas around reproductive rights or questions of consent are very blurred. These ideas are very deeply tied with duties and responsibilities of spouses to one another. So it's very hard to actually tease out, to separate, right, these dominant images from what's actually happening. Just want to bring you to sort of this very popularly known, understood, and seen model of how domestic violence works. It begins with walking on eggshells, right? Thinking about the ways in which people are feeling like something is wrong, something is not quite right, treading carefully, being afraid of saying certain things or doing certain things. I have clients who will say to their kids, you know, clean up the house quick before he comes because he's very stressed out when he comes back from work. Walking on eggshells, this idea that there is going to be an explosion, but you just don't know when. The actual episode of violence, right? The actual explosion. And then the honeymoon phase, this idea that, you know, oh, I'm so sorry, honey, I didn't mean to do this. Or in many cases, why did you make me do this? You shouldn't have provoked me. You know, you shouldn't have smiled at that waiter. You shouldn't have any number of things, right? In the South Asian context, there is often no honeymoon phase because many people in South Asia have a sense of entitlement, right? So while there may be little attempts at trying to sort of stem the situation or make peace with it, there won't necessarily be the kind of honeymoon phase that mainstream activists have seen. In the South Asian context, in fact, this wheel or cycle looks quite different. So I want you to imagine for a second an egg whisker. You know, I don't want to say egg beater deliberately because I don't want it to be a pun, but think of it as an egg whisker, the old-fashioned one, which begins with this big sort of round, and then it's a spiral that kind of goes down. So the spiral with the largest ring is on the top, the shrinking rings below, and then the spiral finally ends in the handle, right? So many activists and field workers have shown this model to be most effective in our worlds. When a person is in an abusive relationship and this person first seeks help, there is a wide range of resources available. There will be parents to whose house she can go to. There will be friends who are saying, no, don't put up with it. Or maybe, oh, let's think about this. Or, you know, a variety of different resources. And then as this woman leaves and goes back and leaves and goes back, and I want to bring to your attention that people attempt to leave 5 to 7 times before they actually finally make the break. As this person leaves and goes back, the perpetrator knows that the resources are dwindling. Think also in your own lives how much you might have had patience dealing with something that is a chronic or a repetitive case. right? So when a person is in an abusive relationship at the beginning, there is a wide range of resources. Again, TIS has discovered that people try and access help within the first 5 years of a domestic episode. After 5 years, their attempt to try and leave also reduces. So it's a very fatalistic, very demoralizing model, but a very true model. Now, bringing sort of this idea of culture and the idea of domestic violence is understood through mainstream to bear on our specific culture. What is the role of social services, support services that are culturally conditioned and culturally nuanced? And for that, I want to stress sort of specificities around our constituency. And Kailash, Mangala, I don't know what the demographic profile of this group is, but I'm presuming that almost everybody is what the US understands as South Asian, which is sort of the Indian subcontinent.
I think that's correct.
That's correct.
Okay, super, super. So thinking about, you know, the South Asian constituency and what is specific about this particular group of people, we have joint families. There are joint family dynamics. We have long distance relationships because many people aren't actually present in the location. And I'll give you an example. Some years ago, this was like 28, 29 years ago, Sprint, which was a telecom service, had done this Saturday, Sunday, you can call up your families back home for whatever, 30 cents versus $3. I don't exactly remember those numbers, but we started seeing a direct correlation between the people that called us on Mondays and Tuesdays versus calling us, you know, later on. We discovered that these long conversations that could happen on cheap phone bills were actually resulting in a fair amount of danger and crisis situations for a lot of our clients. Partners would speak back to their families. There might have been conversations that came up around, you know, what was given or not given at weddings, who came and visited them, what was said, etc. Thus exacerbating sort of relationships here in the host land, in the Americas, looking at long distance abuse as a very specific form of South Asian domestic violence. And I want to stress, joint families, long distance are not bad things in and of themselves. In fact, many of these are wonderful things, right? Migrations, being able to reach back and reach our parents, living together with multi-generational households, many of these can be wonderful things, but they can also be sites which are ripe for the occurrences of certain kinds of violences. And they also bring up certain specificities which we should necessarily be looking at. Joint families, again, when we train the police, we train them to realize that sometimes perpetrators are not just the spouse, but also the family. We have people that are living, you know, two brothers and their wives living together, in-laws, two brothers, or a brother and a sister with his wife living together, etc. So not to make the assumption that the woman that answers a 911 call at the door actually is the person that called in. There might be other people that are actually living in this house. So to understand primary aggression, one has to go below the surface. Thinking about arranged marriages, again, arranged marriages in and of themselves are not a terrible thing, but there is a certain gender inequality that is set into the ways in which arranged marriages are often practiced. In India, the giving away of the bride. I remember when I got married, my mother washed my husband's feet with milk. You know, many of these traditional customs, which we kind of laugh off as insignificant, or we just say, oh, these are beautiful customs. They also perform a cultural idiom through which the girl is understood as the thing to be given away, and the husband's family as that which is much worthier than the girl, right? The hypergamy that is present in these relationships. So what then in our specific South Asian milieu do barriers look like? Why do people not leave? What holds people back, right? Emotional attachment to the perpetrator. Oftentimes the perpetrator is a wonderful father. He might be a really nice son-in-law. He might be a very engaging friend. He might also be somebody that has given you very lovely moments and moments of romance and hope. This is what makes domestic violence different from a stranger violence, right? This is somebody with whom you have shared the inner depths of your heart and your dreams. So hope springs eternal in many people's hearts, and they always think that there's only that something that they need to do to somehow right this situation. Fear for the children. People fear for their children, and so they don't leave. And sometimes people fear for their children, and so they leave, right? I had a client at Maitri who for many years continued to live with her partner because she did not want to split the family. She didn't want her children saying, you know, why can't we see dad? Or, you know, why are you guys fighting? But then one day when he threw the remote across the room and it hit the son, her little boy, who was about 6 or 7, that was her moment to actually pick up her bags and leave, because that was the moment, the epiphanic, in some sense, moment in which she realized this is only going to get a lot worse. Up until then, she had protected the children against this, but now the children had gotten involved. Race, religion, ethnicity. Unfortunately, we don't have all week, but there are many ways in which our religions tell us to bear with it, to put up with it. Our religion tells us that some of these things are manifest, that it is our duty to suffer. And we can sort of debate the pros and cons of this later on. But right now, I just want to sort of highlight these as barriers for leaving. Clearly, economic, financial, linguistic issues. If you cannot speak a word of English, it's that much harder for you to actually feel comfortable or brave enough to leave. Sometimes your partner, your perpetrator may use the threat of your being deported, for example, immigration issues, or saying to you, you know, they will throw you away, but the child gets to stay here because the child is a US citizen. This has happened before. And also lack of resources. Domestic violence is based on power, control, isolation, alienation. All of these things go a long way towards making the person completely bereft of resources. I want to take us to this moment of the pandemic when everything that we are doing to stay safe are actually the things that are putting many people who are in hostile homes at far more danger, right? Social distancing, self-isolating, the ways in which we can't reach out to support services. Police stations are only working on emergency, courts are shut, etc. So sort of the stripping away of all the options to leaving, and exacerbated right now by our current condition. And political climate, I cannot tell you how difficult it is for women to go to court and find ICE agents roaming about, right? They're afraid that they might be asked questions about their passports, about their legitimacy, about their documents, and wouldn't even go to access things that are rightfully their due, that they're deserving of, because they're afraid of the sort of anti-immigrant and anti-immigration sentiment. So in speaking of the ways in which Maitri intervenes, an example that perfectly highlights this need is about a client who called a mainstream agency several years ago. This was in around the 1989-1990 period. Said her name was, let's say her name was Muktaji Sharangpani, right? And she was speaking to a mainstream support person. And she said, you know, my name is Muktaji Sharangpani. And this person said, wow, that's a mouthful. Can I call you M? Now, having worked in a mainstream agency, I know the challenges of working with unfamiliar names, right? How can we effectively help someone if we are just struggling to get their names right and worried about offending them? But from Mukta's point of view, she's thinking, if this person doesn't even get my name right, how is she going to understand the complexities that my husband is the only son, that his widowed mother is precious beyond words to him, that he listens and is swayed by the things that she says against her, that he sees his wife as an attempt to usurp his mom's position, etc., etc., etc. Sort of the cultural dynamics of the situation. So Maitri began in 1991 as a bridge that connected people in need with what existed out there. So we did not duplicate services. We basically formed a conduit through which people could access services. Then we started filling in the gaps when a program did not exist. So our 16 language helpline, our Pots and Pans project, our Desi elderly and teen projects, and then our transition home, which is a holistic shelter and service project. These are all instances of how we filled in the gap when certain services that were useful to our constituency did not exist. Thinking about the ways in which Maitri's mission and values ground the work that we do, thinking about the threefold mission to integrate clients, so to take them away from their sense of isolation into mainstream society, letting them feel like they're full participants in society rather than simply charity causes or some victims to be protected. Focusing efforts on supplementing and complementing what already exists, and then working towards creating services that foster self-reliance and confidence in these clients, guided by the ideas of compassion, integrity, mutual respect, and commitment. All of our programs keep clients front and center. Client-centric, we are very frugal, we respond culturally. So an example of cultural responsiveness is some years ago when the Santa Clara County required that all people that file cases against their partners must be subpoenaed in court. And we worked very actively to resist that particular project, because we believed that many women that might actually call 911 might change their minds. Right? There's a lot at stake for women to actually leave, and to force them to subpoena against their partners breaks many, many values in them around washing dirty linen in public, or bringing their own family member to shame, etc. As an agency, we're non-hierarchical. We work across different aspects of a client's needs. And we pride ourselves on being agile and flexible and responding to the needs of the community. Thinking about the ways in which we do this and the programs that are instituted to assist them, is meeting their needs through a variety of different programs that fulfill their emotional crises, their financial struggles, their legal challenges, the biggest sort of thing that sits between them and homelessness, housing, and then making them self-sufficient. It's been one of our big sources of pride that we actually have a Maitri alumnus group in which our clients who have once been served by Maitri are now serving other clients back. So sort of coming a full circle and feeling like their relationships and their experiences are now going towards creating something better for other people. Of course, we have a lot of sort of caveats in place in which we don't allow them to directly deal with clients. I want to bring up Mangala's comment where, someone tells you a story and you're like, yeah, I've been there. Let me tell you my story, right? We don't want to have clients have to go through that. So we kind of keep a distance, a little bit of a Chinese wall between clients and former clients, but we also have the children of women who were helped by Maitri now coming back and doing projects for us. So not only is there an alumnus, there's also a second generation that is giving back to the agencies. And then last of all, sort of just thinking through our various programs, I want to walk you through what a typical Maitri call might look like, because this is where your intervention as caregivers might arrive. We get calls from all over the place. Now, having been at Maitri for so many years, I will get calls from people I know that say, Mukta, Mangala, I'm using your name, I'm so sorry. But a friend of mine, Mangala, called me and she really needs some help. Can you call her back? And I will say, happy to help Mangala, but we do not call the person because we're not trying to get into a home to tell that person that they need to disrupt their life. That person needs to pick up the phone and make the first call to us, right? Saying something is wrong. This will happen through our partners in the community. Or let's say Mangala for a minute feels like she needs to call up the helpline. She might pick up the phone and call the Maitri helpline 1-8888-MAITRI and say a bunch of different things. She might say, I'm trying to understand what my options are. Or she might say, a friend of mine is in need and I need to help, find out how to help her. Or she might say, what is domestic violence? How do I make sense of what is happening? Something is not right. Help me understand this. So there is no one vanilla formula for a call that comes to us. It spans the gamut. Then there are people who are very quickly calling in just to get a resource. Hey, can you give me the names of 5 lawyers in the Santa Clara County, right? Those are referrals and those are easier phone calls to deal with. But again, like Mangala mentioned about the chaplain who had clients who had been with them for years. One of my oldest clients who has been with me since 1998, and she's still my client, her needs have changed, right? Her sets of resources have changed, her needs have changed. But what is true about many victims of domestic violence is that they are almost always on the fringes of society. So they're almost always very precariously poised on the cliff of crisis, right? Crisis hits them a lot easier than it might hit other more adjusted, functional, safer, stabler places. So I also want to do like a quick nod to the Maitri Boutique, because this has been one of our latest and most amazing projects. It's a vintage, high-end second-hand goods store where people donate clothes that are then purchased, and the money goes towards maintaining rent on the facility. But it's also a wonderful way for people who are afraid of reaching out to Maitri to come in and understand Maitri's services. It's also a great way for people who don't know about Maitri to be softly initiated into the work that Maitri does. I've deliberately kept all numbers, including how many people call us, how many people we serve, etc., out of this presentation, because I want to encourage all of you to go to our website, www.maitri.org, and see all the statistical information presented there. I also want to say that while 97% of our clients are women, we do serve men. We do understand that in domestic violence, men can be both victims and perpetrators, and we have served men and continue to serve men. The barriers for men to report domestic violence is equally, if not more, hard, because there is such an atmosphere of entitlement and machismo, and this idea that how can you be controlled by your wife, that makes it much harder for men to actually access us, as also the popular understanding that Maitri is only for women. So I want to maybe take some time to answer questions or comments that might have come up. And there's also a fantastic homegrown, homemade, very short film that's about 10 minutes long that I would like to play. So I will let my timekeepers tell me how to do this. Shall I play the film first and then do Q&A, or Q&A first and then the film?
I think I recommend film first.
Okay, super. So let me just pause my screen for a second. Oh boy, I've gone into this maze that is Zoom. So maybe we should do like a quick comments. Maybe let's just do comments, not questions. And then I will continue to try and find the film as I respond to your comments. Anybody?
Yeah, this is Ganapati Swami.
Hi, Ganapati.
Hi, Muktaji. Yeah, I think your last statement about men being abused, I put that in the chat a few minutes ago. It's interesting you just pointed that out, because the abuse is always, more often than not, is associated with women being abused and rarely men. And as I was writing in this comment, if women are afraid of, reporting because of fear of reprisal from their counterpart or male abuser. Men has a bigger problem perhaps of being the one of embarrassment, reporting to authorities because, they are being abused by women. I think you made that last comment about when men also can be abused. They do get, and you do get reports of them being abused as well, I understand.
That's right. That's right. We do, and we serve men as well. We've got some fabulous success stories with male clients as well. I guess the reason, part of the reason most people don't even recognize men as abused is because the overwhelming percentage of victims is women. But you're absolutely right to make that observation.
Muktaji, this is Usha.
Yeah.
Is it because men are less likely to be physically abused, so it's not apparent, and probably they themselves don't realize that they're being abused? It could be a psychological or verbal abuse that you don't recognize. Somebody's always putting you down or saying something nasty. You don't realize, you don't connect it to abuse per se as the legal definition is.
You're absolutely right. That's a very, very astute observation. With any kind of abuse, the thing that separates domestic violence from just a bad relationship, right? A lot of people will ask, how do you know this is abusive and it's not just a bad relationship, right? And the two things that separate a bad relationship from an abusive relationship is one, that it is chronic. It happens repeatedly, right? So it's not just a one-off incident where somebody's saying, how do I look? And someone says, oh, you look ugly, right? It's a constant, repeated pattern of behavior that emerges over and over again, which is why it's really hard to leave at the first sign of this, right? Because it takes a while for the victim to recognize the patterns even. And the second thing is that it is intended to strip away at your self-confidence. Now that can happen in many ways outside of physical ways, right? And so like you pointed out, there doesn't have to be physical violence, that a man could be 3 times the size of his perpetrator partner, right? In fact, yet another example of this is in research that was done in India. For many years, people that went through emotional abuse didn't realize it is abuse. When the first slap came, it was an aha moment, right? It's much easier to understand physical abuse as abuse. Emotional abuse, psychological violence, verbal violence is much harder, especially because we're also coming from a culture in which many of us are not complimented, right? We're more often than not just scolded or pulled down by our parents or our family members and so on. So how do we make sense of that in this particular context, right? So emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, denying somebody the ability to have an intimate relationship or making that other person feel like they're just nothing is something that is true of both men and women victims. Yeah. This particular film actually speaks about a child's experience and speaks about the male as a perpetrator, dad as perpetrator. It also points to the very, very a traumatic space that children find themselves in when they have to see the battle of their parents playing out. So I will forward through some of it so that we're not doing the full 12 minutes, but it highlights some of the very lovely stuff that we spoke about in the early parts. Also, all the art in this film is art that young kids have given to Maitri as part of our art contest. So that's what makes it very interesting. All right, so can you see a blank screen right now, folks?
Not yet.
I see. Okay, let me just resume share.
So we are seeing your PowerPoint presentation still.
Okay.
What's the name of the dog?
Milo. His name
Milo.
is Milo. Yeah,
Cute.
yeah.
Cute.
Okay, so I'm going to resume share.
Hello, what's the standing emergency, please?
Please, can someone come here?
Could you speak up, please? What's the emergency?
They're locked inside.
What's happening? Who's locked inside? Can you explain what's going on?
He's yelling. He's yelling and throwing things. My sister's crying.
Are you and your sister in a safe place?
Yes, but he's got her. You need to come soon. Come soon. Ma, Mama.
What's happening? Where is your sister?
Mama, phone up. Put down the phone. Daddy, Daddy, no, Daddy. Shit.
I was 8 when I made that call. 15 years ago, those 15 seconds felt like a lifetime. It was the first time I had protected one of my parents, and the first time I betrayed one. When the police came, everything looked calm. Daddy watching TV, Ma in the kitchen, the baby drinking milk, I brushing my teeth in the bathroom. I heard voices, a few footsteps, and then silence. When I got into bed, I realized I had wet my pajamas. The storm passed. Daddy forgave Ma, forgave me for calling 911. Never mind, he said, never mind, this is all behind us. So we put it behind us. Daddy began coming home early to spend time with us. He took us all shopping and bought me a toy train complete with tracks and stations. We watched TV together with the baby in his lap, and I played video games with him. We ordered pizza with extra toppings, and Ma Skyped with Nana Nani. Oh man, it was so special. We worked hard at forgetting that he'd flung the remote at Ma's face and cut her lip, that I'd hide under the bed to become invisible, that he'd snatched the milk bottle from the baby till Ma begged him to give it back. But then a door banging somewhere, a tires, a loud voice in the TV would throw me into a panic. I'd look up and see Ma humming a song. Daddy on his computer, calm and relaxed. Good, good. Go away, dark cloud. Go away. My world looks good. My world looks good. Until once more, the shadow loomed. Ma could sense the shadow too. She'd become moody and irritable and guarded. And then the baby would cry more than usual and cling to Ma. And I, still joined to Ma in strange ways, would thrum against her like a tightly strung guitar string, sensing the slightest quiver in her voice as she sang us to sleep. One day, Ma came to pick me up from school, dressed up all nice. Big dark sunglasses, bright red lipstick, red scarf. She looked like a film star, and to my delight, let me sit in the front of the car alongside her. The baby cooed in the back and the radio played songs. As she parked the car under the pine and came around to get me, I knew why. Why she had worn those big dark sunglasses to cover her eyes and the scarf to hide the bruise on her neck. It had happened again. Ma told me we were going on a secret trip. Was it like last year's when we stayed at the motel nearby? I'd watched TV all day and sucked on ice cubes from the big machine outside our room. But I remember Ma had just cried, and eventually Dad came to take us back home the next day. Where are we going this time, Ma? Why are we taking our clothes in garbage bags? Will Daddy come get us? She checked cupboards, gathered papers, and crammed spoonfuls of baby food into my sister's mouth. Something wasn't adding up, and it made me nervous. Ma asked me to take a toy along, but insisted it be a small toy. But why couldn't I carry the train Daddy got me last week? Why was she ignoring me? I stood defiantly, refusing to help as she struggled with the bags, her keys, and the baby in the car seat. As we drove away, I turned to watch her home and the pine tree beside it grow smaller and smaller and eventually vanish around a corner. Home for months after that was simply a place where Daddy couldn't find us. Motel rooms and shelter space, even our car for a full week. There were forms to fill, lines to stand in. As Ma did her work, I sat outside the offices with the baby. I saw...
I'm going to forward through some of this just in the interest of time, but it speaks about the ways in which her parents intervene and are really mad that she's leaving. And then how the little boy starts
hot and angry all over.
Imitating his father's behavior.
We lived like this in confusion and chaos until we moved into Maitri's transition home. After moving from place to place week after week, it was such a treat to just sleep in the same bed for a year. Soon thereafter, the judge allowed me to start visiting Daddy.
And this is the moment he hits his mother.
Just one time. I saw her face freeze in shock and her mouth open and shut like a fish. For a brief second, I saw recognition in her eyes, as if she saw not me, but Daddy. Then I turned and walked away. Was I turning into my father? The other residents of the transition home were fighting their own demons. Our past taught us to stay alert for signs of danger. It showed in how we moved around each other, avoiding eye contact and stiffening an embrace, constantly guarding our things and our space. But the care and attention here
speaks about
slowly melted our
how
defenses.
hard it is to integrate people
like
back
warm gold and
into
poured
trusting.
in and slowly repaired our jagged, broken lives. Things started looking up. The baby began to walk and Mom found a job. We made new friends who did not make us feel ashamed or abnormal, but accepted. We played in the park and rode our bikes down the street. I didn't miss my old friends anymore. Volunteers came to help me with the schoolwork I'd missed. They took me to the library, and I eventually returned to school.
This speaks about all of the services that Maitri
We
offers.
sang and danced and showed off our special talents. We got Christmas gifts and even little treats year-round. These acts of care meant everything to someone like me who believed I did not deserve happiness. These acts of care told me that our lives, our dreams, they mattered. For every time the road had seemed endless,
And I just want to end with his last comment, which is, but also the fact that it never really leaves you.
maple syrup makes me gag. It's 20 years
Triggers
since
of
that
domestic
day
violence exist.
Daddy saw a sticky mess on the dining table. I should have forgotten by now the events that followed. But maple syrup still makes me gag. If you smelled fear, tasted it, you'll agree when I say that you want to run as far and fast as you can. We did just that. We ran for our lives, for everything that was kind and human in us. We didn't leave Daddy. We left the power that he had over us. We broke the cycle before the cycle broke us.
I took an oath to stand my ground when the feeling comes and great.
Okay. Just a few minutes left, but we let that pass. Okay. How's everyone?
Yeah,
Muktaji, yeah. Do you want to talk about the homework?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is the YouTube link available or easily, or is it in the Maitri site or?
Oh, no, so it's not on the Maitri site. I had actually forwarded the homework to Anup very late this morning. So I don't know if we should put it up right now, or how should I do it? Should I just, it's available.
Yeah. So Muktaji, I have already uploaded and in the Moodle, so they have it, and I have also created assignment for them. So if you can just walk them through, that will be fine.
Okay, super. So it's just two sets of questions. One's a true and false, and the other is multiple choice. I mean, just fill in the blanks. Kailash, are you saying something that I can't hear, or?
No, I think I wanted to kind of wrap up before you, after you are done, just to add a couple of comments about our relationship with Maitri going forward. We want to come to that, but first you wrap it up.
So very brief questions that you'll answer in a heartbeat, all of you. True and false, and fill in the blanks, just 4 questions each. And Anup has the answer key as well. So do you want me to bring up those slides, or? Yes?
If it's not too much time, it may be worthwhile.
Okay, let me do that in a second. In the meantime, would anyone have a comment that they'd like to make?
Great session. Great session.
I thought that is the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, I assume. You made references to TISS, I thought, right?
That's right.
Okay.
It's the Tata Institute of Social Services.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me just get this off my chest quickly. So the two, can you see the screen, guys?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. Let me just share it again. Share, there we go. I just don't want to share the answer key because that would defeat the purpose.
You see a small Niagara Falls.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
So just 4 sets of questions. Answer if it is true or false, and correct the comment if it is false. The first is culture is transmitted in non-biological ways through social interaction. The second is ideal culture is what people do, while real culture is what people say they should do. The third is domestic violence refers only to physical acts of violence. The fourth is when people are in troubled relationships and they come to you, you must instantly assess and tell them to either leave or try and make things work. These are true or false statements. I'd love for you to answer them and also rectify them if they are false. The second set of questions are fill in the blanks, the 3 components of culture. Think of the poop exercise as also the cognitive exercise. 2 examples, and I say IPV, I mean domestic violence, or familial abuse. IPV stands for intimate partner violence. That is more familiarly understood as the phrase in today's day and age in the industry within the South Asian community. So how is DV in the South Asian community different from mainstream? 2 programs that Maitri offers. This was evident both in my last slide as also in the film. And then the 3 reasons why people may stay in relationships, why they may not leave abusive relationships. Yes?
I think that's pretty clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Okay, Mangalaji, you want to say something before?
I just wanted to apologize to her. She wanted to do breakout sessions and we have never done it. So I don't even know if it would have worked because some people are on iPad, some are on phone and stuff. So I didn't want her to, waste time on it. So my apologies. We will figure it out for next time.
No, not at all. This is beautifully run, very well managed. So yeah, please don't apologize.
Okay. So I'll make the last. I think it's been extraordinary for us. This is our 2nd year of training. We are graduating in August, the 2nd group of counselors, Counsel Hindu Tradition. And very significant this year, we're launching the Ananda Core services for the community, call-in services, where counsel will be online guiding people. And we definitely have Maitri as on top of our list for partner organizations. So we want to have a formal conduit relationship. So we follow the protocols and all the required things that we do need to do. So we do want to we'll come back on that and get that done. But that's very much appreciated. And we know it's a very significant problem. And I think we want to be part of the solutions for that. Okay, and thanks again for your time and all the very well done, very comprehensive presentation in a very short time. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Also, just FYI, I again, in keeping with Maitri's philosophy, didn't duplicate what's existing on the website. So please think of the website as a complementary space which adds more to what I've produced for you today. You know, you will hear about our confidentiality on it. You'll hear about how we respect people's rights to sort of both telling their story and withholding their story. You will hear on the website how we do not tell people to leave, but we don't tell people to stay either. We give them information that helps them make informed decisions about how to go forward. We acknowledge and listen to their pain without constantly thinking of offering solutions, etc. So these are things that I didn't dwell on during the presentation. I wanted to produce a new set of work.
Excellent. Thank you again. We'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody, and good luck. Best of luck.
Yeah, good job.
Stay safe. Thank you. Bye.
So
Bye-bye.
let's do our closing prayer.